Hello folks, and welcome to the MRG, that is, Magonia Research Group. This channel is devoted to exploring that which science cannot explain, whatever forms those mysteries may take. We're talking ghosts, ancient mysteries, UFOs, and cryptids. This video is going to be Volume 2 of the now official Beyond High Strangeness series. This means you are about to hear a further 3 stories that are completely in defiance of any classification within the Fortean field. Keep your arms and legs inside the vehicle at all times, and try not to lose your head. Now, let's start with something pretty strange but unfortunately lacking in much detail. This is the tale of the flying tractors of Malita, as recorded by psychical researcher Alan Murdy, who I actually mentioned in my previous video on Malakin of Dagworth. It would be interesting to see if I can get him on the channel for an interview. So I'll work on that. Anyway, he talked about this story in his article in Fortean Times, issue 369. There is a man by the name of Samuel Luella, who was employed at the Zanzibar resort of Pongwe, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, when he spoke to Mr. Murdy, who was holidaying in the aforementioned country at the time. Luella comes from a small village called Malita, in the Samayu region of Tanzania, and apparently there are legends about flying tractors circulating in this village. These tractors fly through the night sky and are known to abduct people. This would probably be naught more than a curious story, if it weren't for the fact that Luella then claimed to have seen some of these strange vehicles himself. The first time he saw them was when he was a child in, quote, about 1975, when he saw 2 of the aerial abominations. He was told by his grandfather to read the Bible and not to speak of such bizarre things again. His second run-in with the flying farm equipment would take place many years later when he was a young man. He stood with some companions by a river valley on the outskirts of Malita, when the group caught sight of 4 tractors approaching the village across rough terrain. These vehicles were dark in coloration, and seemed to be perfectly physical. They were visible for a, quote, considerable time, before they suddenly vanished in full view of the group of witnesses. It is interesting to note here that the 4 anomalous tractors were seen during a time when the village was trying to impose a quarantine on itself, in order to protect its citizens from a particularly virulent epidemic. Quite what this epidemic was of, Alan Murdy does not specify in his article. He speculates that perhaps the tractors could have been, quote, some kind of mirage, but Luella was doubtful about this conclusion, due to the pervading folklore about aerial tractors in the region. Our next story comes to us from the Russian port city of Rostov-on-Don. It was January 14th of 1978, and 3 18-year-olds by the names of Mikhail Babkin, Nikolay Leontev, and Vitaly Kravchenko were celebrating the recent New Year in the local sports complex called Oktyabynok. Just a quick side note, I've failed to find out if this sports complex was a real place, but there is indeed an October Revolution Park in Rostov-on-Don, and so perhaps there used to be a sports centre here. Anyway, the 3 men had been enjoying steam baths in the sauna and relaxing in the swimming pool, periodically eating and partaking in drinks of champagne and vodka. It was approximately 6 a.m. at this point, and a watchman, quote, proposed that they go home. He accompanied them to the rear exit of the building, walking them through a long and narrow corridor in the basement area near the pool's walls. This corridor had concrete walls without windows. This will become important later. They were led by the watchman, with Leontev behind the watchman, Babkin behind him, and then Kravchenko bringing up the rear. Suddenly, Babkin seemed to trip over, after seemingly putting his left leg in some kind of non-existent, quote, hole in the smooth concrete floor. He screamed in shock, and just as Leontev turned around in bafflement, he witnessed Babkin's shoulder pass through the solid concrete wall, before his entire body disappeared through the surface. Dumbfounded, the witnesses examined the wall with their hands, searching in vain for any hidden doors or crevices. Mikhail Babkin found himself in a small and dark room. To his left, there was an object resembling a medical examination chair, and across from him he could see a slightly opened door. There was a narrow window on the right wall of the room, out of which he could see the tops of trees, all covered with dense green leaves, moving about as if blown by a strong wind. Of course, this made no sense, It should have been a winter's night, not broad daylight in what appeared to be summer. Plus, a few seconds ago, he had been walking through a subterranean tunnel, and now he was looking out at the fourth-story floor of some unknowable building. As if in some kind of trance, Babkin moved towards the door and pushed it open. He then entered another room. This room was also mostly dark, save for the round platform on the ceiling, which was giving off a faint light. There were no windows in the room, and a similar-looking, quote, medical chair stood near the wall. At this point, Babkin was starting to feel lightheaded, and continued moving, almost on autopilot. He wandered forward and opened another door, stepping into the strangest room of his bizarre adventure yet. This room was almost entirely black, except for some limited areas of brightness. These lights seemed to hypnotize Babkin, and he became numb, feeling unable to look away from them. To his alarm, he noticed several humanoid figures in front of him, faintly lit by the pulsating lights. There were 5 of them, standing stone still in front of him. Their heads appeared rectangular. The entity stood in front of the group, seemed to be slightly hunched over, and appeared to be, quote, working on some kind of small device resembling a, quote, corn cob with a pointed end. This object gave off light. The creature pointed the object at Babkin, and it emitted a very bright light. Strangely enough, however, this light didn't illuminate the surrounding area, instead seemingly being contained somehow. As the light was pointed at him, Babkin heard a male voice in his head, saying, "This one?" To which another replied, "Not him." The first voice replied with a terrifying statement. "Memory erasure is necessary." Babkin realized that he was about to lose his memories, and immediately found himself in a state of panicked horror. He was able to snap out of his stupor, running back through the door, and suddenly finding himself back in the corridor of the sports complex. He screamed in mad hysteria, hearing a door slam behind him, but seeing no door in the wall when he turned to look at it. As it turned out, his friends had been searching for him for about an hour, running all over the complex in confused despair. However, according to Babkin, he had only been in the strange otherworld for 5 minutes. Now, this case is very interesting because one could attempt to attribute it to an alcohol-induced hallucination, as indeed researcher Patrick Gross did. But I would beg to differ with this dismissal. Even if it was a hallucination, it still has psychological value. The motifs of an abduction scenario are still there, right down to the use of a vaguely rod-shaped instrument that emits light. Also, the corncob-shaped object could well have been a pine cone, and a pine cone, or something which looks like a pine cone at least, is seemingly a universal symbol of the divine. I'm actually planning to make a video on the weapons and objects used by entities in these sorts of odd encounters, so the little display you're looking at on the screen will be explained in much greater detail in the future. Also, this sort of tale of interdimensional skullduggery may also be familiar to viewers of my previous Beyond High Strangeness video. By the way, my source for this tale is Albert Rosales and his Amazing Humanoid Encounters series. He got it from Russian researcher Alexei K. Primya, about whom I have failed to find any information at all on the internet. I have decided to save what is by far the weirdest story in this video, and heck, perhaps even the weirdest one ever told with a straight face, for last. On Saturday the 11th of July 1998, an individual by the name of Scott decided to reach out to the now-defunct Ghost Discuss mailing list with a tale from his childhood that defies any sort of categorization, let alone explanation. He said that he knew what it seemed like he saw, but that he prefers to insist to himself that there's simply no way it could have been what he actually saw. He must have been mistaken. Right? It happened years ago, and Scott can't quite remember how old he was back then, but he thinks that he can't have been more than 9, meaning that the event might have taken place sometime during the summer of '84. His maternal grandparents lived out in the rural countryside, but also only 15 minutes drive away from Scott's home. He was spending the weekend with his grandparents, and what he saw on the Friday night of that weekend would stay with him forever. It was dark out, and Scott was perched on the couch, turned to face the large picture window in the room and sitting on his knees. He was waiting for his grandpa to arrive home. He was alone in the house with his grandma, and as he watched, a thick fog started to form outside. His grandmother was growing more and more worried about her husband having potentially had an accident due to the low visibility and his ever-growing lateness. I can imagine Scott felt a rush of relief when he saw two lights coming up to the road towards the house. He had been waiting for several minutes since the fog had arrived, and now it seemed as if his grandpa would be getting home safe and sound. However, the more he watched the lights, the more he realized that they were the wrong color. One was, quote, lemon yellow, while the other was pink. He watched in curiosity as the lights moved closer. Eventually, he shouted for his grandma to come and have a look at them. His grandmother was busy preparing dinner at this point, and didn't want to leave the kitchen. Scott took another look at the lights, which were coming ever closer, but still weren't entirely visible beyond being just fuzzy-looking blobs due to the fog, before running into the kitchen to persuade his grandma to come to the window. He explained that there was a pair of lights approaching the house, to which she replied that she was happy that his grandpa was getting home. Scott insisted that they didn't look like car lights, mentioning the strange coloration. Finally, the grandmother relented and agreed to check out the lights. Scott ran back to the window and assumed his kneeling position before his grandma could arrive. He took a hard look out of the window. The lights were still there, and seemed closer than before. They were now taking on a more solid shape, looking as if something was emerging from the fog. His grandmother leaned forward for a closer look. He asked her what they were, and she didn't know, seeming now to be quite scared by the sight. The lights were almost at the house at this point, and thinking back on it, Scott came to realize how bright they must have been to be visible from the house at all when they were further away. Now, it was finally visible just what the lights were. They were cows. Bulls dancing on their hind legs. Scott insists this wasn't a joke. The bovine abominations were dancing along the road, next to each other on their hind legs, with one of their front legs draped over the shoulder of the other. One of them was glowing yellow, while the other was bright pink. They were headed towards the driveway. Scott's grandma immediately fainted at this point, and he remembers looking at her as she collapsed beside him. He resumed staring at the cows in disbelief and shock. The bulls continued dancing along until they got to the driveway, at which point they turned as if to make their way up to the house. At this point, however, they simply faded away and disappeared from sight. After a while, apparently about a minute of dumbstruck awe, Scott turned from the window and focused on his grandmother. He had no idea how to bring her back to consciousness, and so resorted to just shaking her and talking to her like you would a sleeping person you were trying to wake. Eventually, she started to stir, and as she woke up, she turned to the window. Scott told her that, quote, whatever we had seen was gone, and then asked her to clarify what exactly they had seen. His grandma sat him down on the couch and firmly told him that he was not to mention what they had seen to his grandpa when he got home. He asked her why this was, and she refused to give an answer, simply telling him to keep quiet about it. Just a few minutes later, they both heard a car door slam outside. Grandpa was home, and the second he entered the house, Scott ran up to him and told him everything that had happened. Grandpa seemingly took the sighting quite seriously, sparing only a second before asking his wife if she was okay. The moment she answered in the affirmative, he grabbed his shotgun and marched outside. Scott's grandma scolded him loudly for telling him. Several minutes later, the older man re-entered the house, having failed to find anything. To this day, Scott's grandparents refuse to discuss what happened that night. However, that wasn't the end of the story just yet. Pretty soon after the actual incident, Scott managed to convince himself that he and his grandma must simply have been hallucinating from the fog and a pair of headlights, or something like that. But several years later, when he was about 12, a friend of his, under the pseudonym A for Scott's later report to the mailing list, came to him with a bizarre story. This story sounded familiar. Too familiar. When Scott was living in Ohio, A's grandparents had been living directly behind them, and A had lived mostly with her grandparents during the summer months. Their 2 yards were separated only by a small one-lane alley. There was a railroad bed running across A's grandparents' backyard, about which Scott had apparently posted on the mailing list before, making me wonder what sort of other phenomena were to be seen around the area. And then a small farm on the other side of the railroad bed. They both lived right at the edge of town. Anyway, A came to Scott one day and said that she'd seen something, quote, very strange the previous night. He asked his friend what she'd seen, to which she proclaimed that he would think her crazy if she told him. He pointed out that she'd already brought up the subject, and so she clearly wanted to tell him despite her assertions to the contrary. A agreed, and set about telling her tale. Late that night, A had found herself unable to sleep, and so decided to look out of her bedroom window. It started to grow foggy at this point, and A claimed to have noticed 2 strange lights moving across the pasture behind the farm. One of these lights was yellow, and the other was pink. I'm sure you know where this is going. Scott had not told anyone about what he and his grandmother had seen, and yet here was something that was cutting progressively closer to the bone. As the lights got closer and closer to the railway bed, they started to take on more solid forms. Scott was racked by cold chills at this point, but A interrupted herself and said that she shouldn't waste time telling the rest of her story. After all, she must have been seeing things. Scott continued to insist that she told the full story, and after a few minutes she relented. She was almost in tears at this point, and she managed to choke out at last that the lights had taken on the form of cows. Bulls, to be precise. They were dancing next to each other, stood on 2 hind legs, with a front leg draped over the shoulders of the other. The surreal apparitions moved towards the railway bed, towards A's grandparents' house. At this point, A had turned away from the window, and had hidden her face under the blankets until daybreak. After she told her story, Scott told her his own. As far as Scott knows, A never saw the bulls again after that. He'd never seen them again either. He ends his report by saying that he would have convinced himself that he had been hallucinating were it not for A's story, but now he knows that he and his grandmother saw something that night, whatever that thing may have been. Permission to feature this story was granted to me by one Elizabeth Bush. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. She not only owns the website on which this terrifying tale was originally preserved from the mailing list, but also published it in Volume 1 of a book series called the True Ghost Stories Archive. I've put the cover up on screen now, and I recommend that you go buy this book. Elizabeth is great. Congratulations! You've made it to the end of another video. Thank you for putting up with me and my crappy microphone. So, you know when I said that this channel would have a fairly regular rate of upload? Well, evidently I lied. But I promise that I will not always have been lying. As in the very near future, this channel will have a much faster rate of upload, because I actually have 2 video ideas / scripts already on the go. So those will be published in the very near future, and yeah, and from then on out, the sky's the limit. So, yep, I will see you in the next one, and goodbye.